Okay, thank you very much for the kind introduction, Jutta. I have also no conflict of interest to report. Let me talk just a little bit about the Continuous Update Project, which is the backbone, basically, of the new recommendations. The CUP represents a rigorous, systematic, and ongoing program to gather, to present, to analyze, and to judge the global research on how diet, nutrition, and physical activity affect not just cancer risk, but also cancer survival, and to make cancer prevention recommendations. So the process is structured such that scientific research from around the world is continuously added to the CUP's unique database, which is held and systematically reviewed by a team of scientists at Imperial College London. Then an independent multidisciplinary panel of scientists, of experts, carries out ongoing evaluations of this evidence and uses its findings to update the cancer prevention recommendations and helps inform policy on cancer prevention and survival. Now, the judgments on the strength of evidence rely on predetermined criteria that are based on an accepted framework. The conclusions for each either cancer site on the one hand or each exposure are summarized within matrices, one of which you can see here. This is just a sample matrix. And only conclusions that are based as, that are judged to be strong evidence, so either an evidence level of either convincing or probable, form the recommendations for, form the basis for the recommendations. And to the right, you see the panel of slightly modified Bradford-Hill criteria of evidence that form the basis for the systematic review analyses and the criteria also for judging the evidence. So that is including, most importantly, the number of studies, what type of studies, for example, prospective studies instead of case control studies, the quality of the way the exposure as well as the outcome was assessed in the studies, possible heterogeneity between studies, of course, threats to validity such as confounding or bias, the presence of a biologically plausible mechanism connecting the exposure to the cancer site, and lastly, of course, also the magnitude of the evidence. So these are all important criteria that are taken into account in summarizing the evidence, formulating the recommendations, and then making suggestions for policy action. So one of the main pillars of the new recommendations is the association between weight gain, overweight, obesity, and cancer. So this is an area where the evidence is most consistent and very strong. In fact, the new report covers a total of 12 cancer sites, as previously mentioned. That is a total of 5 cancer sites more than was published in the last second expert report from the year 2007. Now, the new cancers that have been found to be strongly associated with obesity or overweight or weight gain are noted here in red. I've shown them in red. So that would be liver cancer, cardiac cancer of the stomach, the cancers of the mouth, pharynx, and larynx as a combined endpoint, advanced prostate cancer, and cancer of the ovaries. So those are the new ones. The others had already previously been found to be associated with body mass index. And so this is a list now according to decreasing levels of magnitude of the association. Strongest evidence is seen for endometrial cancer, where we have a 50% increase in the risk of developing endometrial cancer for each 5-unit increase in body mass index, which is weight in kilogram divided by height in meters squared. The list then goes down all the way to colorectal cancer, which on the one hand shows some of the most consistent evidence, but on the other hand has, in this whole list of cancers, shows somewhat lesser magnitude of an association with a risk increase of 5% for each 5-unit increase in body mass index. And so you see on the far right column the level of evidence, which is either convincing for the majority of those cancer sites or probable for almost half of those cancer sites. So in both senses, graded as strong evidence for an association, for a positive association between overweight, obesity, or weight gain and the development of these cancer sites. Along with the weight exposure, there's a second exposure that has also formed a very strong basis for the recommendations. That is physical activity. It's sort of also seen as a counter exposure to obesity, but it does not reflect just the absence of body mass. It's really an independent exposure, strongly determining risk of 3 cancers. Here also listed in descending order of magnitude of the association. So we see the strongest association between physical activity and endometrial cancer incidence, and we see a somewhat weaker but still strong association with colorectal cancer, and then finally with postmenopausal cancer of the breast. There's also an association, of course, with premenopausal cancer of the breast, also an inverse association, but that evidence has not been deemed to be strong, so it's not listed here in this slide. Moving on to the dietary exposures that have been evaluated in depth during the last 10 years and have been used to update the report and as well as the recommendations. We have the first 5 sets of exposures that all relate to colorectal cancer, either as a decrease or an increase in risk. Specifically, there's strong evidence that regular consumption of whole grains is associated with decreased risk of colorectal cancer. Foods containing dietary fiber also decrease risk of colorectal cancer. Dairy products and calcium also decrease risk of colorectal cancer. In contrast, the regular consumption of red meat and or processed meat is strongly associated with an increased risk of colorectal cancer. We have the next exposure, alcoholic beverages, which is a single exposure, but it's related to a total of, depending on how you count them, 6 cancer sites. So if you take the mouth, pharynx, and larynx as one joint cancer site, then adenocarcinoma of the esophagus, liver cancer, colorectal cancer, breast cancer, and stomach cancer. Previously known were 5 of these cancers. New from this report is the association with stomach cancer. So that was a cancer site that had previously not been strongly associated with risk, and here in this new report the evidence has accumulated such that it's now possible to classify the association between regular consumption of alcohol and stomach cancer as convincing. Another beverage of great interest and of widespread consumption is coffee. It's been on our radar screen for quite some time, had also incidentally been on the radar screen in the former report, but it hadn't quite reached the evidence level yet for any of the cancer sites. And here, new evidence showing that regular consumption of coffee is associated with decreased risk of 2 cancer sites, namely cancer of the liver, hepatocellular cancer, and endometrial cancer. Finally, glycemic load is strongly associated with increased risk of endometrial cancer. We have another set of dietary factors which we summarize under the term special circumstances, which refers mainly to the fact that these dietary factors or foods are consumed regionally or only in certain geographic parts of the world, sometimes in clusters, for example. This pertains, for example, to arsenic in drinking water, where we see increased risks of not only lung and bladder cancer, but also skin cancer. Then for large parts of Africa and some parts of Asia, we see that aflatoxin-containing foods pose a risk factor of convincing evidence for liver cancer. The regular consumption of mate, which is a tea that is drunken scalding hot in certain countries and areas in South America poses increased risk for squamous cell carcinoma of the esophagus with strong evidence. The consumption of foods that are preserved by salting increases risk of stomach cancer. Cantonese-style salted fish increases the risk of cancers of the nasopharynx. And evidence coming from some of the trial data from the 90s and 2000s showing that high dose and regular use of beta-carotene supplements increases the risk of lung cancer, but this risk increase is restricted to people who either were former or are current smokers. It does not extend to never smokers. Finally, a dietary factor, if you will, breastfeeding has been convincingly shown to decrease the risk of breast cancer in the breastfeeding mother. Then we have, beyond anthropometry, as I showed you for the BMI data, and then physical activity and the dietary data, we have a fourth set of exposures that have recently been found to also strongly determine the risk of cancer, and that one of those risk factors is height, attained adult height. So there's something that in the development of children and adolescents that leads to the adult height. So it's obviously not the height itself that is the risk factor, it's a marker of a risk factor that is associated with a factor leading to greater longitudinal height, is a strongly associated with increased risk of cancers of the colorectum, the ovary, the breast, pancreas, kidney, endometrium, prostate, and skin. So that's fairly consistent evidence, so there has to be something going on with developmental factors. That is something that's emerging overall in the report. And also, as, similar to this exposure, there's a theme relating also to development in that greater birth weight or its consequence. So not the birth weight itself, but factors that associate with greater birth weight are probably a cause of premenopausal breast cancer. And as I said, the mechanisms underlying these associations are not very clearly understood as to date, so more research in this area definitely needed and is ongoing. I highlighted the fact that body mass index or overweight, obesity, and weight gain were a prominent risk factor for a whole host of cancers, 12 cancers. And so because of the consistency of this evidence, the report and the third expert report contains a separate section on the dietary or lifestyle determinants of weight gain or overweight or obesity. With the idea that if there are dietary or lifestyle factors that strongly increase the risk, convincingly increase the risk of overweight or obesity, then they, by virtue of increasing the risk of obesity, indirectly would then also impact upon cancer risk, and so have been included in the report also as a novelty in the report. And so there's convincing evidence for a decreasing risk of weight gain, overweight, and obesity either through walking or aerobic physical activity. So those are the two factors, important factors. And then dietary factors that lead to a decreased risk are dietary fiber, a so-called Mediterranean type dietary pattern. We call it Mediterranean type because that's the way it was assessed and reported in the underlying studies, as well as having been breastfed also leads to a decreased risk of developing overweight later on in life, especially during the adolescent period. In contrast to that, there is convincing evidence for an increased risk of overweight, obesity, or weight gain for screen time in terms of lifestyle. And then when we come to diet, sugar-sweetened drinks, fast food, and so-called Western-type dietary patterns lead to an increased risk of overweight or obesity. And so, based on these findings, the WCRF AICR have formulated 10 cancer prevention recommendations that are shown here, and you've seen the slide previously in Jota. We have these not as a list of foods or items or lifestyle factors, but it really should be more interpreted as an overall package, an overall lifestyle that not individual factors, but the combination of these factors really determine the risk of either increasing or decreasing your risk of cancer. So those would be, first and foremost, being a healthy weight and being physically active. Those would be the two on the bottom, this one here and this one. Then we have, also equally important, a diet rich in whole grains, vegetables, fruit, and beans. And then a second, or the next set of recommendations are to limit consumption of fast foods, processed foods, red or processed meat, sugar or sugar-sweetened drinks, and alcohol consumption. Finally, not to use dietary supplements for cancer prevention, for mothers to breastfeed their babies if they can, and for cancer survivors to follow the cancer prevention recommendations if they can. So those would be the recommendations as they stand. As I said, as an overall package, not in individual items picked out. And so when you see that package and you see the individual foods listed or lifestyle factors listed, you will obviously see that there's quite some similarity between these and the 2007 recommendations. That is no coincidence. It actually is reassuring to see that the evidence is very similar to 10 years ago, and it increases our confidence that the evidence is really based on strong scientific studies. And as I said, it's not the specific foods or nutrients, as more the entire pattern of diet and physical activity that in combination with each other determines risk. There's some emerging evidence that's also coming out from the report. Data are not quite there yet, but pointing in the direction that we are beginning to learn more about individual levels of exposures and also cancerous subtypes. We haven't been able to do that previously, so now we can parse out, for example, risk factors for advanced prostate cancer, or for example, cardiac stomach cancer. In the 2007 report, that was not possible yet. The cancer sites were treated as a whole back then. And then a second theme I mentioned has to do with body mass mainly, is a theme that the life course in general plays a dominant role, and for example for overweight or obesity acquired during adolescence poses risk then for the decades to come for the individual. And the influence of height, I mentioned that prominently. There's something about height as a marker for developmental factor that leads to cancer risk. More needs to be understood in that area. And then new as well is, of course, the recommendations for cancer survivors. That's a completely new area, very emerging, not solid data yet, but evidence is accumulating. So this is my last slide. In summary, I hope I was able to show you that the third expert report provides a comprehensive analysis and presents a robust basis for science that can be used to formulate recommendations for cancer risk as well as cancer survival, and also offering guidance for future studies in this area. Thank you very much for your attention, and ready to take questions.
Time for 2 questions, please. Problem. If you can identify yourself and your organization. Thank you.
Umberto Cornelli. I'm a clinical pharmacologist, a teacher of the Loyola University Medical School in Chicago. Well, I enjoy very much your talk, but unfortunately I disagree with a couple of points, and I will focus on this. When I have to tell the students the story about the meat, the processed meat and cancer, when I went through all the data, I've seen that this trial put together hamburgers and ham from Parma, which are totally different kind of processed meat, because in the Parma ham doesn't contain the nitrates, whereas in the hamburger you don't know what the meat is put out. So the question is what I should tell to my students concerning the processed meat.
Thank you for the question. So indeed, that is a question that we have asked ourselves continuously over the years. We unfortunately lack the databases that would allow us to specifically determine the really exact contents of the processed meat. We know that there's factors that can either be contained in the meat or be or be synthesized in the body as part of the meat consumption. Of course, there's much debate about the actual factors, but the database that we are working with does not contain or does not split out or parse out the actual individual factors, be it nitrates or heterocyclic amines or polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or whether it's the iron. So there's numerous hypotheses that really need to be followed up, probably in smaller scale directed studies before we can learn more about the actual mechanisms. And I think for the students as a guideline, it's not a problem, to me at least, it wouldn't be a problem to present that quite frankly, that the epidemiologic data is showing us some signals, for many of which we don't have definitive answers yet in terms of mechanism.
Hi, my name is Mary Conkey. I'm a naturopathic pediatrician from Seattle, Washington. And my question is about carbohydrates and colorectal cancer. I've had some concerns about patients being on low carbohydrate or no carbohydrate diets as sort of a fad diet. And I'm wondering if the relationship between whole grain carbohydrates and colorectal cancer is purely fiber related, or is there some other mechanism?
Are you talking about patients now, or healthy individuals that develop incident cancer? Or
I guess it's more of a philosophical question.
more?
It's more of a philosophical question. I'm just wondering,
Okay.
in general, for the whole population, if people are avoiding carbohydrates, if we'll see an increase in colorectal cancer.
Yeah. Well, I think we'll hear a little bit about the mechanism relating to carbohydrate intake, hyperglycemia, insulin sensitivity as one of the hallmarks of cancer development that also is covered in the talk by Dr. Janab. So I think probably it would be wise to put that question on hold and then have it be covered in the section on mechanisms. Okay. If you can wait that 10 minutes. Thank you.
If that's okay, we can leave the questions for the discussion that we have at the end.
A short one, a really short one.
Okay, if it's a short one, then go ahead.
Maya from Israel. Do you think, because of the data that you showed, that there should be special screening tests for cancer for obese or overweight people?
That is a difficult question. Probably not, because it would not be feasible. The population of overweight and or obese people is in Western countries and populations approximating or even exceeding 60%. And so to imagine that we would be able to screen that number of people, we'd basically be screening the whole population. So I don't think it's feasible. And screening really is all about a trade-off between sensitivity and specificity. So we really need to implement screening programs where we can, first of all, prevent false positives, of course, as well as false negatives, but then also present programs that are feasible and fundable. So I wouldn't recommend screening the whole population for obesity. Quick answer.
May I also have a very short question? Could you give an example for the supplements not to be taken for cancer patients? The supplement?
The supplement?
One example.
The clearest evidence is for beta-carotene supplements for current or former smokers. There is some evidence showing, for example, that high-dose consumption of multivitamins, where it's not clear what kind of vitamins in the multivitamins it is, but that high-dose multivitamins are also adverse, for example, for developing prostate cancer. So the idea is that a healthy diet should contain all the constituents, micronutrients needed for both cancer prevention and avoidance of premature death in cancer survivors, and that should not be it should not be necessary to supplement that with dietary supplements, except for in certain circumstances, malnutrition, malabsorption. Those would be exceptions.
Thank you, Michael. So we'll continue with the second talk.